Good afternoon. My name is Ioanna Sitaridou, and I teach linguistics at the University of Cambridge. My talk is part of a series of talks co-organized between the Hellenic Centre in London and the Cambridge Centre for Greek Studies, where I serve as a deputy director. I would very much like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and of course I would very much like to thank you for watching my presentation. Today, I will be discussing a previously unknown dimension in the diachrony of Greek. I will be focusing on Romeyka, which is a Pontic Greek variety still spoken in Turkey today. So how has it all started for me? It was in Oxford in 2006 when I was invited to deliver a talk that I met Professor Peter Mackridge. Professor Mackridge introduced me to the topic, and it will probably be an understatement to say that this encounter has been anything less than transformative for my research. So why archaic Greek is still spoken in Turkey today? Historians will actually tell you that Islamization of Greek-speaking populations started in the 16th century, lasting a couple of centuries. Therefore, by 1923, when Greece and Turkey were signing the Treaty of Lausanne, these populations, by virtue of being Muslim, were never part of the exchange of populations. Today, we find three remaining enclaves. The first enclave is the one in Chaikara. The second one is the Surmene enclave, and the third one is the Tonya enclave. Fortunately, we know very little about the Tonya variety. In my talk, I will be focusing today on the Chaikara variety, which together with Surmene, they form the historical variety of Off. But before I actually tell you more about the research as such, I will explain a few things about my fieldwork and the methodology I have used in order to collect data from the speakers in the village of Anasta. I have followed the ethnographic approach, which essentially means that I was trying to integrate in the village life. I was staying with a family, and I was participating in their everyday chores. I monitored sociolinguistic information carefully because quite often this information proves to be of extreme importance when we analyze the data. Needless to say, I always followed guidelines regarding consent and ethics. I never collected any data from any speakers without obtaining permission from them beforehand. I used pre-designed questionnaires, which I administered orally. The reason for that was that the majority of my female speakers were, in fact, illiterate. Another aspect of my fieldwork methods, which I'm particularly proud of, is monolingual data collection. Essentially, after my first field trip, I was in a position to use Romeyka to collect data from the speakers, and I believe that has greatly enhanced the quality of the data I was able to collect. I was collecting more authentic data as a result of me making the effort to speak Romeyka. So in this slide, you can see some information about the size of my corpus. It comprises audio recordings, video recordings, and images. And the majority of the corpus remains without annotation. I'm hoping for some grant to be able to carry this out. There is a good number of research outputs so far, and the research is ongoing. In fact, I'm currently working on some deliverables as part of a new grant that I have received from the British Institute at Ankara. So the major findings allowed me to claim that this particular variety of Pontic Greek goes back to Hellenistic times. Now, this was if you like, an interesting claim to make, because until the point I made this claim, the majority view was that all Greek varieties were in fact medieval varieties. That's why they were called modern Greek dialects rather than anything else. But what sort of tools, what sort of historical methods did I use to be able to put forward such a claim? Essentially, I followed a combination of the traditional historical reconstruction coupled with language acquisition. Professor simply explained about heritage languages and first and second language acquisition in her talk last week. So essentially, I married, if you like, the historical reconstruction approach with language acquisition. And essentially, I departed from the premise that reanalysis takes place during child language acquisition. On this view, it follows that reanalysis is constrained by both pre and post reanalysis grammars, and that it must be acquirable on the basis of the same primary linguistic data. This method imposes interesting limits on the possible hypotheses that can be entertained. So it's not actually a type of framework that over-generates a hypothesis, if you like. So essentially, my method was asking, how did speakers reanalyze the grammar to reach the present stage grammatical configuration? And were the cues needed, were they found in the medieval Greek record? Or is it the case that Hellenistic Greek cues were essential for such reanalysis? Now, of course, there are several, in fact, interesting problems and puzzles along the way. For instance, a very interesting problem is what happens when certain phenomena look like they continue a characteristic or a trait of Hellenistic or classical Greek, whereas in fact they may be the result of language contact with Turkish. So this is particularly interesting to try to solve and try to discriminate, if you like. So I will be focusing on the Romeyka infinitive, which is in fact the word that has been published back in 2014. And I will tell you what I discovered by studying the Romeyka infinitive. What I found out in a nutshell is that Hellenistic cues are indeed needed in order to explain the current behavior of the Romeyka infinitive. So we cannot account for the Romeyka infinitive on the basis of medieval data alone. So let's take a look at the distribution of the Romeyka infinitive today. We find it as a complement to modal verbs, as we can see in the examples here. So speakers of Romeyka in the village of Anasta would say things like "Uche poresa mairepsini," I couldn't cook, and this form, mairepsini, is an infinitive. It doesn't reveal who is doing the action. Of course, in modern Greek, this would have been replaced by a na clause. However, it wasn't that straightforward, because although native speakers would use the infinitive in the example that we have just seen, "Uche poresa mairepsini," crucially, they wouldn't use it with the same verb in the same tense if there was no negation we can see that in 1 and B, in A and B in the slide. Επόρεσα τσιμηθήνη, they never say. Επόρεσες τσιμηθήνη, they never say. Also, it's very interesting that unless the modal verb is in the past tense, the infinitive cannot be licensed. So essentially, C is also ungrammatical in Romeyka. So essentially, the only possibility seems to be when we have the negation and the modal verb is in the past tense. This is a very complicated and intriguing distribution if you think about it. The second environment in which we get the Romeyka infinitive today is as complement to volitionals. So ouche θέλεσα μαϊρεψίνη is perfectly fine, but as previously seen, θέλεσα μαϊρεψίνη without a negation is not okay. Another type of environment where we find the Romeyka infinitive is the so-called before clauses. Πριν σπουτζισίνει σωμαντρίν, τσιπάω. Before I clean the barn, I'm not living. And another context would be counterfactuals like B. Ασίσεν πορπάτεσιν σαρασία. She should have taken a walk in the mountains, but actually he or she didn't do that. So what is the sort of analysis that we can possibly offer? The analysis that we can actually propose on the basis of this peculiar distribution, which I summarize here as being found in counterfactual conditionals as a complement to negated past tense non-veridical verbs, like I couldn't, and in before clauses have one feature in common. They are all anti-veridical environments, which essentially led me to the claim that the Romeyka infinitive behaves like a negative polarity item. So it sounds very sort of exotic, but in fact, many other languages have verb forms behaving like negative polarity items. An equivalent of that in English would be words like nobody, so and anybody. So for instance, anybody can only be triggered in English if we have a negation. And the Romeyka infinitive seems to be conditioned by the same sort of underlying factor. So what can that actually tell us about the evolution of the Romeyka infinitive? Now, it was very important for me to be able to have an analysis of the present day infinitive before I ask the question of how did speakers reanalyze it the way they did. Otherwise, as you can imagine, we would be trying to explain something with too many unknowns, and that is always methodologically very challenging. So having an analysis of a contemporary Romeyka infinitive, we can ask the question, how did this happen? So the reason why I claimed that the Romeyka infinitive dates back to Hellenistic Greek rather than medieval Greek is because, as we have seen, the Romeyka infinitive is used in before clauses. Now, before clauses, which combine with an aorist infinitive, which is also the morphological nature of the Romeyka infinitive as well, is found, of course, in ancient Greek, as we can see in example A on the slide. And of course, it also continues in New Testament Greek, as can be seen in example A. So the Romeyka equivalent we have seen, and it's actually B, πριν πισίνει φαΐν, πριν σπουτζισίνει σωμαντρίν, τσιπάω. Now this before plus infinitive construction became obsolete in medieval Greek. Now this is particularly interesting because although the Romeyka infinitive as a complement follows the medieval pattern of losing ground to not clauses, The before clauses maintained the Hellenistic Greek setting. Crucially, the before clauses stopped selecting for an infinitive in medieval times. And in fact, there are very few occurrences of before plus infinitive in the medieval Greek record, and only found in texts where they are quite high register and therefore learned. There was also another interesting proof as to why the Romeyka infinitive dates back to Hellenistic Greek times. And that has to do with an innovation of the ACI, the accusativus cum infinitivo construction in before clauses. This can be shown in A, so in A, which is an example from New Testament Greek, πριν αλέκτορα φωνήσε, τρεις απαρνήσιμε. And what we actually see here is an example of πριν selecting an aorist infinitive. And interestingly, the subject of the infinitive, which is the rooster, is not the same as the subject of απαρνήσιμε, which is second person singular. So we have a case of disjoint reference. Now, importantly, this was an innovation of Hellenistic Greek. Classical Greek did not allow for accusativus cum infinitivo in before clauses. Importantly, Romeyka also allows for an equivalent of A, as shown in example B. Πριν πισίνει φαΐνη αησέ, εγώ τσιπάω. Again, here what we see is that the subject of the infinitive, namely aishe, is not the same as the subject of the main verb chipao, which is ego. So again, here we have disjoint reference. Now, of course, the construction A is also never found in medieval Greek. So the reanalysis I put forward was a reanalysis which essentially required the existence of Hellenistic Greek cues. Otherwise, the child would not have been in a position to reanalyze the infinitive as a negative polarity item. Crucially, if the Hellenistic cue was not necessary, we may have seen such a reanalysis happening in medieval Greek, which allowed for infinitives and counterfactuals and as complements to modals. Crucially, this was not the case. Therefore, we can conclude that the existence of the before plus infinitive anti-veridical environment was of great importance in essentially presenting the necessary critical mass, if you like, for such reanalysis. I'm running out of time and I won't be able to tell you more about the Romeyka negation, which, however, also poses some very interesting questions as well. Namely, is it the result of Byzantine porridge or is it a case, again, of a Hellenistic Greek substrate being operative? So the only thing I will be mentioning is that we have a very complex system of negators, as we can see on the slide. Romeyka has 6 negators, 5 of which are non-veridical negators. And again, I'm hoping to be able in the near future, to present you my analysis of the rise of this complex infinitival system. So one more thing, which I also think it sheds some very interesting light on the evolution of Romeyka, is that computational phylogeny, and especially the computational phylogenetic work carried out by the York group, has actually shown that Romeyka is an outlier when compared to other Greek varieties, such as, for instance, Southern Italian Greek or Cypriot Greek. For this paper, the York research team and myself looked at the noun phrase. So again, here we have evidence from another area of the grammar for an earlier substrate, and earlier than the medieval, of course. So overall, the position I put forward was that to explain the historical evolution of Romeyka and Pontic Greek as a whole, we need to evoke the Hellenistic Greek roots, and we need to assume contact with other medieval Greek varieties in a leapfrog manner, that is, in a discontinuous manner. So these varieties, the Pontic Greek varieties, doesn't mean that they were not in contact with medieval Greek, but the contact was limited, the contact was fragmented, and it was discontinuous. Crucially, however, we cannot account for quite a few of the phenomena today without assuming some Hellenistic Greek cues. As a last word about the future of this variety, the linguistic vitality of Romeyka is low. Of course, the vitality is much better in the countryside, in the villages, in the area of Trabzon, but actually it is much worse in Istanbul. So the speakers of Romeyka in Istanbul are essentially have all become heritage speakers, and if you have followed Professor Tsimpli's talk on heritage, on Greek as a heritage language, perhaps I don't need to explain anything more. But it is true that we see these sort of two gears, if you like, the along the rural-urban axis. So in the rural communities, vitality is higher, and we have greater levels of competence, whereas actually in Istanbul, the speakers of Romeyka are heritage speakers, and therefore the vitality is considerably lower. So much that actually we should really worry about its preservation. The stance of the speakers, however, at least in the village of Anasta, is very positive. So for instance, they would say that they are very fond of Romeyka, that this is their ancestral language and they're very much connected to it. So perhaps this is this gives us some hope for the future. Preserving languages, any language, all languages is of extreme importance. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I would be delighted to hear from you. Feel free to email me on my university email, which is very easy to find out. If you would like to know more about the project, please visit the Romeyka website. Thank you very much for watching this presentation.